Okay, we're going to begin. This crazy coronavirus is playing havoc with our emotions. It's doing that with me, and that's a struggle because as disciples of Jesus, we want to stay positive. We want to express a sense of contentment in our lives. Yet as the weeks have turned into months, we have discovered that instead of contentment, sometimes the common attitude we're displaying is resentment. And we're just trying to keep from becoming too negative. Anger, frustration, discouragement, anxiety. Well, we're all over the board when it comes to this COVID-19 thing. But perhaps the most common emotion we share is a delicate but perpetual sadness because things are so different. We're sad because we can't meet together as a church. Sad because our contact with others is limited. Discouraged by the distance imposed upon us, even the way we relate to members of our family. We're grieving because some of our friends have lost their jobs. And some have lost their lives. In fact, the most vulnerable among us, we're sad because the most vulnerable among us are still at risk and we don't know what to do about it. We cannot be with our aging parents. We cannot adequately grieve those we've lost. We cannot hug. We cannot touch. We have difficulty now even sharing our joys and our sadness with one another. And because of all that, there is an unrelenting sadness, and we just don't know how to deal with it. As Christians, the theme of our life is joy in Jesus, not sorrow in circumstances. But right now, circumstances are so overwhelming that the sadness seems to linger. We know that God's people are not protected from grief and pain. We know that's part of life. We realize that Jesus himself wept. But this thing that's happening today seems to be different because life itself has changed so much, and there is an inherent sadness in that reality. What do we do with our sadness and our sorrow? That's the subject of this lesson. When you read the Old Testament, you discover that instead of turning away from sadness, God's people embraced it. Just as we are living in the middle of an unexpected tragedy, a worldwide pandemic, so the people of Israel endured a series of catastrophes. The first was their enslavement in Egypt, and they cry out to God in their pain, in their trauma, and their distress. And we read this in the book of Exodus. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God responds to their groanings, not with a lecture to buck up, but with compassion and with action. And we read this. This is what the Lord says to Moses. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. And so Moses becomes the vehicle through which this rescue takes place. In the Old Testament, of course, the greatest disaster of all was the Babylonian exile. That event was so traumatic that it provoked the writing of an entire prophetic book devoted to conveying the nation's pain and sadness and trauma. And that book, of course, is Lamentations, written probably in 580, shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. Many have thought that Jeremiah was the author of Lamentations, but in the book itself, no author is named. So it's probably just as well that we acknowledge that we don't really know who the author is. Some Jewish, faithful Jewish person who lived through the destruction of this city. We may not know who the author is, but we can surely know his circumstances. He's living in a city that's been devastated by an opposing army. The king of Judah and most leading citizens of that city have been taken captive. The Jerusalem itself is in ruins, and the Temple of Solomon has been razed to the ground. So the author cries out in unrestrained groaning and sadness, and he offers these comments about the city he loves. He writes, "How deserted lies the city." You know, I think some of us could have said that back in April when this lockdown started and no one was getting out. How deserted lies the city once so full of people. How like a widow is she who was once great among the nations. How bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed festivals. All her gateways are desolate. Her priests groan. Her young women grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Look, Lord, and consider, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see, is any suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me? Lamentations is not the only book that expresses sadness. In the Psalms of lament, all those many Psalms, excuse me, we listen to people who describe their pain, their hurt, and their grief, and their disappointment. Roughly 1/3 of the Psalms are lamenting that things are not as they should be. In our own present crisis, we can read these Psalms and we can receive encouragement from those who openly express their sadness to God. Psalm 6, my soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long? I'm worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. Psalm 13. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? Psalm 31. Be merciful to me, Lord, for I am in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and body with grief. My life is consumed with anguish, and my years by groaning. We read those Psalms and we read men and women who openly acknowledge their grief and their sadness before God. But you know, we also read of occasions of lament connected to the life of Jesus. One of Jesus' most noted miracles, we observe a cry of pain from a man in great distress. Jesus and his entourage are walking along the road toward Jerusalem, and a blind man named Bartimaeus yells out from his spot at the side of the road, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He knows that Jesus is coming, and so he makes this cry. The crowd tries to silence him, to keep him from saying anything, but he cries again, even louder, Son of David, have mercy on me. His cry is not unlike the pleading sobs of the poets in the book of Psalms. Of course, Jesus hears that cry of lament, and he responds with compassion and healing. In Luke chapter 13, Jesus will offer a lament of his own as he reveals his own emotional reaction to the unbelief of the city of Jerusalem. He says this, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed prophets and stoned those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. The deep sadness and regret expressed by Jesus in this situation is real and apparent and very poignant even. Even the words spoken by Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane are a kind of lament. The introduction of the scene reveals Jesus' own emotional turmoil. Mark says this: they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him. He began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Notice these words he spoke before Peter, James, and John. Jesus opens up his heart and reveals the depths of his distress to these privileged men. And then by himself, he prays. Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Of course, the sadness here is apparent, the distress, the anxiety in Jesus' spoken words are obvious and undeniable. Of course, the most powerful and personal lament delivered by Jesus was spoken when he was hanging from the cross. Both Mark and Matthew record his words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A direct quote from one of the most poignant Psalms of lament, Psalm 22. So many words have been written trying to explain that verse. Some say it reflects Jesus's taking his sin upon us and being separated from God. But in my own mind, the experience of crucifixion has brought Jesus to a place where he cries out in anguish and grief, struggling with the apparent absence of a father he is dependent upon all through his earthly ministry. While Jesus, though, was hanging on the cross, his disciples were offering their own laments. The morning, one explained the sadness and the disappointment with these words: "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." On the morning of the resurrection, the first response was not joy, but tears of grief. If you listen to James Ebram's communion meditation, he referenced these words. Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, finds it empty, and begins to weep, wondering why someone is taking Jesus' body. And she explains her tears with these explanations: "They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they've put him." And while Mary is weeping, the apostles are hiding behind locked doors, fearful that the Jewish leaders will now come for them. And then when Jesus miraculously appears before them and shows that he is alive, the person to whom they first announced this event responds not with faith, but with doubt. Thomas, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." Tears, locked doors, doubt. They all seem to go together. They're all different ways of saying similar things. They all reveal a difficulty in facing that which lies ahead. And perhaps they also sum up a lot of what we're feeling right now. We too have shed tears. Sometimes it seems that we have been forced to hide behind locked doors. We also perhaps have wrestled with doubt. And we're asking, what can we do about this? How long is it going to go on? Is there even reasons to be hopeful? Well, if the early disciples found Jesus coming to meet them in their tears and their fears and their doubt, perhaps he comes to meet us in the same way. Maybe the sadness we feel becomes the path through which Jesus joins us. Maybe in our sadness, we can not only learn from him, maybe we can even draw closer to him. For you see, it's in our sadness that we confess our faith. When we experience goodness and wholeness in this life, we turn to God in praise and thanksgiving, and that's so natural. But we also turn to God when we experience brokenness and suffering and sadness and loss. Faith is not simply an intellectual assent to certain religious propositions about God. It's trusting our whole selves to God, no matter what we may be experiencing. Even when God seems distant, we turn to him, still believing that he cares for us, that he's present, that he loves. Even when our emotions are in turmoil and we don't experience God's closeness, we still believe that he loves us, and we speak knowing that he's there. Even if God seems not to hear, we still cry out to him, believing that he is always within shouting distance. For you see, offering our sadness to God and lament is not a failure of faith. It's an act of faith. It's an acknowledgement that God is there, that we are bringing our entire self before him, knowing that he accepts our sadness and our grief and our loss. And in our grief and pain, we cry out directly to God, because deep down we know that our relationship with God counts. It counts to us, and it counts to him. In our sadness, we also grow our faith. It's in the sadness of groaning that we learn to be more selfless people. It's the difficulties of life and the hurts associated with those difficulties that prepare us to help others. When Israel was rescued from the horror of slavery, the Lord expected something of them. He expected them to treat the unfortunate with compassion. In the book of Exodus, he says more than once, remember what it was like to be a slave, assist the poor, protect the widow, welcome the alien. Contrary to what the hedonists say, there is value in sadness and pain. When our heart is broken, we know how to minister to the brokenhearted. When we hurt, we learn how to share the pain of others. When we walk through the valley of the shadow, we understand how to guide others now on that journey. I really believe this, brothers and sisters, there's going to come a time when this present crisis is over, when this coronavirus is under control, but a vaccine has been discovered and people are protected. And when that day comes, we will look back on the sadness and the pain and the difficulty of those long months, and we will discover something we didn't expect. We will discover that God has prepared us to be better people, and that our hearts have become more fully open to the hurts and the sadness of others. In our sadness, we also share our faith. We have these words of Paul, you remember, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Sharing joys and sorrows together may seem like the most natural thing in the world to you, but I would say that it's really something radical and different, because it's quite different from the way most people live. In a world of fundamental self-interest, we as people of God look to the interests of others. The most natural thing in the world is for me to focus on my joys and my hurts. I want to draw attention to what's happening to me. In the lives of those who have been transformed by Jesus, the focus is on what's happening to you. I want to know what's going on in your life. I want to share your hurts and your victories. In a world of distance and detachment, Christians share their joys and their fears. In our present Facebook culture, some sociologists are affirming that most relationships lack depth. We want to talk about ourselves, but only in a very positive, in a very superficial way. Well, in the midst of social relationships characterized by detachment and self-protection, Christians open their lives to one another. God has designed his community to be a place of openness and acceptance. If there is any environment where we can reveal our pain and our hurt, it ought to be in the setting where we join together as the people of God. In a world that focuses only on pleasure, Christians embrace both joy and sorrow. Large part of human life involves pain and hurt. Many have chosen to wall themselves off from the anguish of others. They may be open to the experiences of pleasure, but they prefer to block the pain. They don't want the suffering of others to dampen any enjoyment they may get out of life. Well, in contrast to that attitude is Paul's call to share sorrow as well as joy. A pleasure-seeking culture may wall itself off from hurt and pain, but those who follow the example of Jesus will, like him, sometimes laugh, sometimes cry. For the truth of the matter is this: when we share in the hurts and victories of others, we're doing exactly what Jesus did. He came to this earth and he shared in our joys. He performed his first miracle at a wedding celebration where he provided the wine. He also came to share in our sorrows. In the city of Nain, he observes a grieving widow who's lost her only son, and he responds and exclaims with compassion, "Don't cry." Then he will shed his own tears, the death of his own close friend Lazarus. But he came not just to share in our joys and our sorrows. Jesus came to share in the effects of our sin. We have this passage from the Apostle Paul: God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. In a very real way, brothers and sisters, when we share the sadness and burdens of others, and when we share our burdens with them, we in truth continue the ministry of Jesus.